Today's author, Ranjini Manian, stand a little more. Ladies and gentlemen, none of whom I can see because the lights are absolutely plunging into our eyes here, but I'm assuming there's a vast audience of Ranjini supporters and admirers here to help us launch this book. I'd heard that Ranjini was good at thinking out of the box. I didn't expect her to interpret it quite so literally and produce a book inside a box to launch, but believe me, it beats the experience of struggling with too tightly wrapped books that you have to release from their imprisonment when you launch them. You know, one of the besetting curses of being in public life these days is the number of books you're called upon to release. And I've now already released more books than I have written. But, and increasingly I fear I'm going to get to the point where I will release more books than I have read. But the case of Ranjini, it clearly is very much a book that is worth reading. Not just because it is a useful book to read. In our 21st century life, this is a country which has still a great deal to learn about connecting with the rest of the world, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So it is useful for those who want to, but also because I believe it is a necessary book. We in India, oddly enough, don't have much of a tradition of what are called elsewhere self-improvement books, in the sense that perhaps we've taken ourselves too seriously, and our books are either fiction, initially very highbrow literary fiction, now there's a lot of mass market popular bestsellers as well, or non-fiction that attempts to serve a larger purpose. And my friend has written a book called The Difficulty of Being Good, and that is not a self-help book. It's an understanding deeply immersed in the philosophies of the Mahabharata. But when you look at Ranjini's book, she's doing two things. She is essentially writing a book for those of us in India who realize the importance of our global role at this point of the 21st century. India is a far more connected economy than it ever used to be. You may all remember that way back in, when we won our independence in 1947, our nationalist leaders did not set about integrating a free and independent India into the global economy. They went the other way. They actually threw up the protectionist barriers and subtracted us from the global economy. Why? Because they had remembered, having fought for so long and so hard for our freedom, that the British East India Company had come to trade and stayed on to rule. And so they were immediately suspicious of every foreigner with a briefcase, seeing him as a thin end of a neo-imperial wedge. The idea was that if they were coming to trade with you, their real agenda was to rule you. Which only goes to prove that one of the lessons you learn from history is that sometimes history can teach you the wrong lessons. So we learned those wrong lessons. We cut ourselves off from the global economy. We already were not, thanks to British rule, a very major player. I think we had 2.6% of global trade in 1947. Within 40 years, we were down to 0.2% of global trade. We were simply not in the business of connecting to the world. And it took a world-class financial crisis for the government of India in 1991, with our then finance minister, now Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, deciding to stand up in Parliament and say those memorable words where he quoted from Victor Hugo, that no power on earth can stop an idea whose time has come. And the time had come for the liberalization of the Indian economy and for restoring its connections, reviving its connections to the rest of the world. And in the last 20 years, India has become a significantly globalized economy with a tremendous element of the drivers for its growth coming from its provision of goods and services, particularly services, to the rest of the world. And this increasing openness and increasing acceptance has been challenged, not least politically. Mr. Livermore and I didn't have much time to speak. We exchanged a few words, or in my case, words, in his case, an expression of despair about the political reaction to the government's decision to permit FDI in retail. But the fact is that we are, despite all of that, moving forward to create an India that is truly integrated into the global economy of the 21st century. It's not easy, it takes time, there will be steps forward and steps back. I sometimes try to reassure people potential foreign investors that when I first trudged the halls of the Ministry of External Affairs way back in 1977 as a graduate student doing my PhD thesis, I remember being met by a grizzled veteran who had already retired from the Foreign Service, who told me, you know, my dear boy, Indian diplomacy is like the lovemaking of an elephant. It is conducted at a very high level, accompanied by much bellowing, and the results are not known for 2 years. Now, this is fortunately much less true of Indian diplomacy today, which is much more sprightly and agile than it was in those days. But it arguably may be true of Indian economic reforms, which are promulgated from on high amidst much fanfare, but then take an age to be implemented because of the political resistance, the bureaucratic resistance, the entrenched habits of so many years of believing that self-reliance ought to be our mantra, that protectionist barriers had to be thrown up, that bureaucrats rather than businessmen should run the commanding heights of the economy. All of these lessons which were so deeply ingrained in our national psyche that they will take a bit of time to overcome. They have been overcome to a greater or lesser degree, and the visible transformation is before us. Ranjini Manian's book speaks to an India which is much more globally integrated than ever before. An India which has that sort of connection to the global world, and where Indians, and this is where the first comment came in, where Indians now need to be more adept at engaging with this world. In my foreword, I do say to young people something I used to say to student audiences when I was Minister of State for External Affairs, that you're going to grow up into a world in which you will engage much more with the rest of the world than your parents did, where you're certain to be working for a company where you'll be relating to people from other countries, where you're constantly going to be engaging professionally and perhaps socially and perhaps in your holiday travel and so on with people who don't look, dress, sound, speak, eat like you, and yet all of your habits will have to meld together and you will have to be able to get along with it. And what Ranjini does in her book is to try and show Indians the pitfalls of cultural misunderstanding and the opportunities for cultural engagement through getting basic things right. I spent nearly 3 decades at the United Nations. I remember lots of stories in which the fact that we all came from different cultures might have led us down various pitfalls. Thank you, Ranjini, that's very cool. Thank you so much. Language is simply the most obvious of them. There are so many examples. I remember a United Nations official having to speak through an interpreter in East Europe. I think it was Poland, and he used the idiomatic expression, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Whereupon the translator rendered it as, the vodka is excellent, but the meat is rotten, which kind of confused his audience. So language can offer pitfalls. But it's not just language. There are other ways in which one can be misunderstood. In fact, since we have an American on the stage and Ranjini is going to be engaging him on a dialogue, I can tell you my favorite story of cultural misunderstanding involving Indians and Americans, which actually has nothing to do with how the Indians dress or how they eat or the intrusive questions they ask for Americans or how short the skirts of Americans are when they come to India. And none of those classic things, all of which are also real issues. It's more about habits of mind, and it's a story that goes back before our Green Revolution in the 1960s, when America used to advise us on farming. And the story goes that this USAID agricultural expert shows up at this Indian farm where he's welcomed by the very gregarious and hospitable Indian farmer, good Sardarji from Punjab, who says, welcome to my farm. We're very proud of it, but of course with our population pressures and our land reforms, it's a tiny farm, not much larger than this lovely setting we're in this evening. But the farmer says very proudly, do you see that national highway? The American looks, he sees a dirt road. But the farmer says, you know, my land goes all the way up to there, canal. The American looks, he sees a trickle of water. And the Sardarji says very proudly, my land goes all the way up to there. And then he says to the American, what about you? Well, the American is a farmer from Kansas, or one of these prairie Midwestern states where the wheat fields roll on for miles on end. And so he clears his throat and says, well, you know, in the morning I get into my tractor and it takes me 2 hours south to the southern boundary of my farm. And then it's 3 hours in my tractor to the western boundary of my farm. Then I break for a sandwich. So then it takes me 2.5 hours to the northern boundary of my farm in my tractor. And then I get along in my tractor another 1.5 hours to the eastern boundary of my farm. And finally, when it's sundown, it takes me a further hour in my tractor back to the ranch house. And he finds the Sardaji nodding very sympathetically. I know, says the Indian. I too used to have a tractor like that. Which goes to show that cultural understanding is not only about literal understanding, it's that all understanding depends on what your assumptions are. And part of the biggest challenge in dealing with people from other countries is an understanding that they can listen to the same data, the same facts, the same information, but approach them with such a totally different set of parameters in their heads, such a different sets of assumptions in their heads, that they can understand quite the opposite of what you were intending them to understand. And that too is one of the insights, amongst the many insights in Ranjini's book, that Indians will have to master as they grow boldly forth into a world of cultural engagement with the rest of the globe in the 21st century. So I'm very pleased that this book exists. I wish Ranjini and the publishers all success. I wish you all a nice and enjoyable evening and listening to a dialogue between an Indian and an American, who I'm sure doesn't have a tractor. I thank you for listening to me, and all the best to the book. Thank you. Good night.